It is the responsibility of society to let the poet be a poet. It is the responsibility of the poet to be a woman. It is the responsibility of the poet to stand on street corners giving out poems and beautifully written flyers and leaflets you can hardly bear to look at because of their screaming rhetoric. It is the responsibility of the poet to be lazy, to hang out and prophesy. It is the responsibility of the poet not to pay war taxes. It is the responsibility of the poet to go in and out of ivory towers and two-room apartments on Avenue C and buckwheat fields and army camps. I was a literary kid.
And the name Grace, where did that come from?
I'm sure it was my sister's idea. With a Yiddish accent, it's as Jewish as any other name. My grandmother yelled, "Gracie, come in." I never think the word be a writer. I never think like that. I just wrote, that's all. I wasn't going to be a writer. You didn't think like that anyway. I mean, you went to school and you tried to get some profession or other, you know. Try to graduate, be a social worker or something useful in the world. This is really a quote from a story I wrote called A Conversation with My Father, which begins something like this. "I would like you to write a simple story just once more," my father says. "The kind Maupassant wrote, or Chekhov, the kind you used to write, just recognizable people and then write down what happened to them next." And I say, "Yes, why not? That's possible. I want to please him, though I don't remember writing that way. I would like to try to tell such a story, if he means the kind that begins, 'There was a woman,' followed by plot, the absolute line between 2 points, which I've always despised, not for literary reasons, but because it takes all hope away. Everyone, real or invented, deserves the open destiny of life." I began to write stories probably in my mid-30s. Until then, I'd been writing poetry. I'd been living among women and children whose lives in that period, which I guess was really the mid-50s, were very difficult and very interesting to me. So that the pressure to tell some of these stories actually became kind of intense. And I began to really listen to people better than I had been listening to them. To tell you exactly, one day I was at supper with my husband, kids I suppose, and his aunt. And we were in our mid-30s, which is kind of like the prime of life or something. The aunt was probably 40 or 50, and she thought we had some contempt for her perhaps. But she said to us, "Listen, you two, just remember, I was popular in certain circles, and I wasn't no thinner then either." Now, so that line resonated or reverberated or whatever it is for a long time in my mind, and it became the first story I wrote, which was Goodbye and Good Luck.
"I was popular in certain circles," says Aunt Rose. "I wasn't no thinner then, only more stationary in the flesh. In time to come, Lily, don't be surprised. Change is a fact of God. From this, no one is excused. Only a person like your mama stands on one foot. She don't notice how big her behind is getting and sings in the canary's ear for 30 years. Who's listening? Papa's in the shop, you and Seymour thinking about yourself. So she waits in a spotless kitchen for a kind word and thinks, poor Rosie. Poor Rosie! If there was more life in my little sister, she would know my heart is a regular college of feelings, and there is such information between my corset and me that her whole married life is a kindergarten.
And once I'd begun to write in her voice, I finally, by doing that, found my own voice and my own way of writing. And I became a story writer, much to my own surprise.
Her first experience in literature was with Auden. And she tells the story, Auden, who was very proper, told her, "Why are you trying to write like me? You're from the Bronx. You're a woman." And I would say the key to what she taught me in writing was authenticity.
In Grace's case, she was able to write her own voice exactly. So that when I finally did meet Grace and she started talking, all I could say was, "Oh, I know you."
I was pushing this heavy buggy, and I found a book stand with little disturbances of men. I stood there with the babies fussing and read. I read expressions like, "There is a whole college of feeling between my corset and me." I thought, that could come out of my mother's mouth. That could come out of my mouth. This is an urban writer. She writes about women in buggies. She's everywhere that we are. Whatever happens, whoever comes into her life, whoever leaves her life, her children come in and grow and leave. The men come in and get bored and leave. And she's always there, sustaining.
In those days, in the afternoon, I floated by ferry to Hoboken or Staten Island, then pushed the babies in their carriages along the river wall, observing Manhattan. "See Manhattan," I cried. "New York. Even at sunset, it doesn't shine, but stands in fire, charcoal to the waist." But this Sunday afternoon, on Mother's Day, I walked west and came to Hudson Street. Tricolored flags flying over old oak furniture for sale, brass bedsteads, copper pots and vases by the pound from India. Suddenly, before my eyes, 22 transvestites in joyous parade, stuffed pillows under their lovely gowns, and entered a restaurant under a sign which said, "All pregnant mothers free."
Her characters were on the street. They said outrageous things to each other. It was that enjoyment at frank enjoyment of sexuality. And what were people writing in those days? Nothing like that.
No one can imitate her because there's something she does that nobody else does. She can say things that others might have thought or felt or didn't even want to know they felt. No sentimentality, but such tenderness, passion, and also such an awareness of mortality. For Europeans or for foreigners, she evokes America with its multitude of voices.
You can't kill the spirit. She is like a mountain, bold and strong. She goes on and on and on. You can't kill the spirit. She is like a mountain. Oh.
I once said to her, "Grace, if you had any political wisdom to give young people, what would it be?" And she said, "Oh, it's very simple. You sit down and you stay down." Which is exactly what she did her whole life. We were marching on the Army base at Seneca Falls. It was a big demonstration. And you turned around and you saw a world of women snaking across the landscape. It was about a mile long. They had said that anyone who tries to climb that fence is going to get arrested. And suddenly I see Grace is struggling to get up over that goddamn fence. She can't do it. Finally, two young women hoisted her up. And when she had one leg over the fence, she turned and grinned at us all and made the V sign And you saw she was the happiest woman in the world, and she had come to get arrested.
We were sitting in to block the induction center south of Manhattan.
Grace's group was charged by the police on horseback. Grace was furious and went up to the officer and either physically shook him by the neck, although Grace is so short, I doubt she could have done that, but in any case, yelled at him to get his men off to stop this at once. It was outrageous, which it was.
She grabbed him and she asked him, "What the fuck are you doing?" So that was probably the first time we went to jail together.
I said, "Grace, I knew you were Irish, but I didn't know you had such a temper." And she said, "David, I'm not Irish, I'm Jewish." One has to assume that Grace had a substantial FBI file. That would be very unfortunate if she didn't.
She left from our farm in Vermont the day she left for Vietnam. She went over representing the anti-war movement, and what the Vietnamese did was, as a gesture to the American peace movement, they said, "Well, you can bring back American prisoners, we release them to you." The minute they got out and in the plane, they dropped them at the first place, I think it was in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. And at that point they were debriefed. They were given an American uniform, and I don't think she saw them again.
I gave away that kid like he was an old button. Here, old button, get off of me. I don't need you anymore. Go on, get out of here. Go into the army. Sew yourself onto the colonel's shirt or the captain's fly, jackass. Don't you read the papers? Why are you leaving now? That kid walked out of here like he was the cat's pajamas. What are you wearing PJs for, you damn fool? Why are you crying? You couldn't get another job anywhere anyways. Go march to the Army's drummer. Be a man like all your dead uncles. Then think of something else to do. Lost him. Sorry about that, the president said. He was a good boy. Never see one like him again. Why didn't you repeat that, Your Honor? Why don't you sizzle up the meaning of that sentence for breakfast? Why don't you stick him in a prayer and count to 10 before my wife gets you?
We really had gotten to the kernel of what was the basis of militarism and war by thinking of it in feminist terms, because people don't really say that war is made by men. It's kind of like the elephant in the room.
Every time you think of a new war starting, it really is a bunch of men who got together and decided to kill each other. And we all suffer for it, and then women get into it. But then they're not just as bad. They don't go out slaughtering and raping. They're very bad at that, women. I was really more in the anti-war movement first. And then the whole women's movement comes along, which is really extraordinary. I think the women's movement, to tell you the truth, is the most important movement in the whole world. I mean, if it hadn't happened, it would be a great tragedy. And besides, it couldn't have not happened. And all of a sudden, I realized that I was writing women's stories.
My husband gave me a broom one Christmas. This wasn't right. No one can tell me it was meant kindly. I don't want you not to have anything for Christmas while I'm away in the Army, he said. Virginia, look, please. It comes with this fancy dustpan. It hangs off a stick. Look at it, will you? Are you blind or cross-eyed? Thanks, chum, I said. I had always wanted a dustpan hooked up that way. It was a good one. My husband doesn't shop in bargain basements or January sales. Still and all, in spite of the quality, it was a mean present to give a woman you planned on never seeing again, a person you had children with and got onto all the time, drunk or sober, even when everybody had to get up early in the morning. I asked him if he could wait and join the Army in a half hour, as I had to get the groceries.
Grace and I come from a time when women were very socialized into a secondary role in a marriage. It was very difficult to assert yourself without, in some way, people interpreting as that you were putting your husbands down. Although we weren't. The women's movement was very good for us. That's probably why Grace says that the women's movement was so important. I think it gave her a real sense of herself.
But she's not a feminist, and it's not the hardcore of her politics by any means. I don't see how it penetrated her view of the world or of life, or certainly not her work. That we were, it's funny, both the left and the right accused us of destroying the family. Family life has always been much more important to her than anything else.
All feminist writing doesn't have to be out front feminist writing. It's more subversive, actually, when you just find yourself feeling with the woman's lot in whatever situation you're reading in.
Men and boys in the world were burdened by demands to act and behave in certain ways, to act towards women in certain ways, to think about women and to think about themselves. It seemed like men were leading a very, very hard life, and that women's hard lives were in their own hands, in a sense, and they could begin to change it. But that men were not about to make any changes in their lives unless they began to pay attention to what was happening to women. Fathers are more fathering these days. They have accomplished this by being more mothering. What luck for them that women's lib happened. Then the dream of new fathering began to shine in the eyes of free women and was irresistible. On the New York subways and the mass transits of other cities, one may see fathering of many colors with their round babies on their laps. This can also happen in the countryside. These scenes are brand new and exciting for an old woman who requires hope. For the old fathers are gathering once again in familiar army camps and comfortable war rooms to consider the eradication of the new fathering fathers who are their sons, as well as the women and children who will surely get in the way. One time by the accident of a judge, I spent a whole week in the Women's House of Detention. It was a funny experience because I lived right around the corner from the Women's House of Detention, which was on 10th Street at the time.
Where Angela Davis was also.
Yeah, and I used to look out the window and I could see my kids going to school,
I loved the Women's House of Detention. I mean, you would walk by, people were always standing across 6th Avenue yelling up to their mothers or their children or whoever.
Apart from visiting, they could see each other out the windows and yell out back and forth, how's the kids,
She got to know the women, many prostitutes there. She heard their stories. Everything was a story. And the amazing thing about her was, except for politics, she was non-judgmental.
I was herded with about 20 other women, about 90% black and Puerto Rican, into the bullpen, an odd name for a women's holding facility. There, through someone else's lawyer, I received a note from home telling me that since I had chosen to spend the first week of July in jail, my son would probably not go to summer camp because I had neglected to raise the money I'd promised. I read this note and burst into tears, real running down the cheek tears. It was true. Thinking about other people's grown boys, I had betrayed my little son. The summer, starting that day, July 1, stood up before me day after day, steaming, the city streets, the after-work crowded city pool. I guess I attracted some attention. You white girl, you never been arrested before? A black woman about a head taller than I put her arm on my shoulder. It ain't so bad. What's your time, sugar? I got to do 3 years, you, huh? 6 days. 6 days? What the fuck for? I explained, sniffling, embarrassed. You got 6 days for sitting down in front of a horse? A cop on a horse? Horse step on you? Jesus, these cops are getting crazier and stupider. Maybe we'll get you out. Oh, no, I said. I wasn't crying because of that. I didn't want her to think I was scared. I wasn't. She paid no attention, shoving a couple of women aside. Don't stand in front of me, bitch. Move over. What are you looking at? She took hold of the bars of our cage, commenced to bang on them, shook them mightily, screaming, "Hear me now, you motherfuckers, you grotty pigs. Get this housewife out of here." My parents, they were part of a generation in Russia that hoped they could be Russian. Jews who thought they could be Russian, just like the Jews thought they could be Germans. They would talk about being in prison in Russia and getting out and running away and finally coming here by my grandmother, my babushka, putting all our money together and getting them the hell out. They were kid socialists. They were 18 years old. First they had my brother and sister, and then suddenly I was born about 15 years later. My sister really loved poems. I mean, I had somebody who read me poems, and then I wrote a line or two lines, and I showed it to her, and she'd say, "Oh, that's wonderful." You know, kids need an appreciator. I find her papers these days, and I find her having written poems and so forth that she kept hidden, and she just let me flower while she watered me. My mother worked in the garment industry while the men went to school. My mother did not live to be old because she got cancer very early, and then she died when she was 59. My father, once he learned English, he read English. He became a doctor by the help of my mother and aunts all going to work. He paid off. You know, they didn't go to school, but he paid off. My grandmother came when they were like 2, 3 years old, my brother and sister, so she and my aunt probably took care of them. And they spoke Russian almost entirely. And then the voice of the street was not all Russian, it was Yiddish, a lot of Yiddish. And the women sitting on boxes, they used to sit sometimes on a chair, a folding chair, sometimes on a box in front of the house when the weather was nice, talking with a mixture of Yiddish and English and Russian, all those Eastern languages. I feel welcomed by English.
So many immigrants come to this country and they just want to be white. And it means that they shave off everything that has any flavor, you know, just so they can be bland and blend in. And that was just not Grace. She kept her sound, she kept her memories of, you know, her neighbors and her neighborhood. And she had a really strong connection, it seemed to me still, to the Russian Jews.
When I was about 9 years old, I was a member of an organization called the Falcons. We were socialist youths under 12. We wore blue shirts and red kerchiefs. We met once a week, or was it once a month? To the tune of "Maryland, My Maryland," we sang. "The workers' flag is deepest red, it shrouded oft our martyr dead." We read it with the socialist ending, not the communist one. At our meetings, we learned about real suffering, which was due to the Great Depression through which we were living that very year. Of course, many of my friends already had this information. Their fathers weren't working. Their mothers had become so grouchy, you couldn't ask them for the least little thing. Every day in our neighborhood, there were whole apartments, beds, bureaus, kitchen tables, out on the street. We understood that this was because of capitalism, which didn't care that working people had no work and no money for rent. Despite its adherence to capitalism, prejudice, and lynching, my father said we were lucky to be here in this America. I was married in 42 and had kids, 2 kids later. They really were, I'd say, more important than anything, Nora and Danny. Their father's name was Paley, and he was a film cameraman. Just, that's what he did. We got married very young, and he was a very, very good person. Then we parted. I think why people part is they come to the end of a conversation. It's very different than, it's not the end of sex, because that could still be good, but it's the end, like the conversation has ended.
I saw my ex-husband in the street. I was sitting on the steps of the new library. "Hello, my life," I said. We had once been married for 27 years, so I felt justified. He said, "What? What life? No life of mine." I said, "Okay. I don't argue when there's real disagreement." I got up and went into the library to see how much I owed them. The librarian said, $32 even, and you've owed it for 18 years. I didn't deny anything, because I don't understand how time passes. I have had those books. I have often thought of them. The library is only 2 blocks away. My ex-husband followed me to the books return desk. He interrupted the librarian, who had more to tell. "In many ways," he said, "as I look back, I attribute the dissolution of our marriage to the fact that you never invited the Bertrams to dinner." "That's possible," I said, "but really, if you remember, first, my father was sick that Friday. Then the children were born. Then I had those Tuesday night meetings. Then the war began. Then we didn't seem to know them anymore. But you're right, I should have had them to dinner."
Well, I was sitting on the steps of the new library. But apart from that, and somebody did pass by, and I thought, oh, he looks a lot like Jess, you know. But then it didn't, you know. So as I walked home, I invented this story. The story is a big lie, after all, since, as I said, it never happened. That's the world telling me the story, really, of what could have happened.
For her, perhaps it was not autobiographical, but the essence of Grace, I think, is in all of her work. Her stories often never end. Those people just keep talking. And there's just a point at which she stops, and then you continue in your imagination.
I met Robert Nichols. I used to see him out this window, going to work. I was very taken with him.
She has a story about looking out the window at the people passing on the sidewalk. I was working as an architect, and she used to see me with my briefcase going down, or my portfolio. She noticed me.
Oh, I met him at the Village Peace Center.
And I was the one who was maybe gazing at her more than, you know, I mean, she was a good-looking woman, but that's not why we're there. So it was only later that we got to know each other better.
I was positive he was Jewish, and I said, why did he change his name to Nichols? Well, a dumb name to change yourself to, you know, so, but it turned out he didn't. His name was Nichols for life, so.
We were all very warm towards each other because we were doing, you know, anti-war work, and it was exciting. You know, you get to like people in the movement. It's a very sort of a hot time for attachments.
When I wasn't married to Jess, I was living with Bob. I mean, I've always lived with a man from the time I was 19 years old, and one that I really liked a whole lot. I mean, I've never not been in love, to tell you the truth. I'm really with Bob now for about 35 years, and I love him as much as I ever did. But, you know, I picked a guy. You got to pick the right guy, girls. I read a couple of love poems here, so I thought I ought to read an anti-love poem, so you should know life is real, you know. This is called Anti-Love Poem. Sometimes you don't want to love the person you love. You turn your face away from that face, whose eyes, lips, might make you give up anger, forget insult, steal sadness of not wanting to love. Turn away, and turn away at breakfast, in the evening. Don't lift your eyes from the paper to see that face in all its seriousness, a sweetness of concentration. He holds his book in his hand, the hard-knuckled, winter, wood-scarred fingers. Turn away. That's all you can do, old as you are, to save yourself from love.
I moved to the country, to Vermont, because my husband came from there. It was his hometown up there in Vermont. And people would always ask me, well, how's it affected your writing? I mean, in what way has it affected you? And I couldn't think really of any way, but then I realized that that I had begun to write a lot of poems about, you know, trees and flowers and stuff like that. That I only really have one poem about trees when I lived in New York. It's really about a specific tree because, you know, in New York, you really, I mean, in the city, you have a tree in front of your house, you get to like it, it's your tree, it's a tree.
When she left for Vermont, I was devastated, and I was missing her. She used to have a political table on 6th Avenue and 13th Street, I think it was, and she and what she called her affinity group would put out political pamphlets, and you would sign things, and you would talk. You could spend an hour there arguing and gossiping. It was glorious. And suddenly it all moved to Vermont.
She has such an extensive life, you know, ranging from books to politics to family to people to go for a walk with, to talk to somebody about grandchildren. I'm one of those people, as well as a colleague who did political work with her and also illustrated a book with her.
A midrash on happiness. A midrash is usually some commentary or story on biblical things, but this is only on happiness. What she meant by happiness, she said, was the following. She meant having or having had or continuing to have everything. By everything, she meant first the children, then a dear person to live with, preferably a man, but not necessarily. By live with, she meant for a long time, but not necessarily. Along with, and not in preferential order, she required 3 or 4 best women friends to whom she could tell every personal fact and then discuss on the widest, deepest, and most hopeless level the economy. The constant, unbeatable, cruel war economy, the slavery of the American worker to the idea of that economy, the complicity of male people in the whole structure, the dumbness of men, including her preferred man, on this subject. By dumbness, she meant everything it has always meant, silence and stupidity. By silence, she meant refusal to speak. By stupidity, she meant refusal to hear. For happiness, she required women to walk with, to walk in the city arm in arm with a woman friend, as her mother had, with aunts and cousins so many years ago, was just plain essential.
I discovered Grace Paley's fiction on board the USS Yorktown off the shores of Vietnam. Some sailor's girlfriend had left a Vogue magazine, and there was a Grace Paley story adjoining a beautiful photo essay about Babe Paley, the wife of the CBS chairman, who was the great beauty of her generation. And because her name was Babe and Grace's name was Grace, I conflated the two and thought that she had written the story. I thought it was a weird kind of disconnect that this hothouse beauty was writing about moms in Washington Square Park. I came in search of Grace. I found her at Sarah Lawrence, and when I encountered her at the health food bar, she looked very unlike the swan that I was expecting, but I felt immediately the magnetism that we all felt and enjoyed.
I met Grace at Sarah Lawrence in 1966, I believe. She was new on the writing faculty, and I had never even heard of her name. We were introduced, and I thought she was very cute. It was only after that that I read some of her stories, and they, as they say, they blew me away.
I walked into her office and said, I've written a novel. And I had been interviewed by all the other writing teachers who were incredibly impressed with the fact that this child woman was, you know, writing a novel. She pushed some paper away and she said, oh yeah? And I hated her right away. I just thought, forget it. And I also fell in love with her at the same time. When you walked into this office, 30 years ago. Papers everywhere. If you wanted to know where your assignment was, it was somewhere under, hundreds and hundreds of papers. She'd be in her kid sneakers with a ponytail, jumping around on the phone. Darling!
And I found out that they offered an MFA program, and I went back to Sarah Lawrence, and I studied with Grace, and it took me forever to get that MFA, partly because whenever Grace wasn't there, I dropped out. And so it was more like stalking Grace than studying with her in a way.
Grace conducted her class like an orchestra rehearsal before the music really started. It was seemingly chaotic, but she got much more out of us collectively than she could have, please raise your hand when you have something to say.
One day I read a piece that was extremely personal, and the class just didn't understand it and really tore into it. Grace leaned over and she took my hand. I was sitting next to her, and she held it. And I met the other Grace, which was this completely maternal wonder. And she stood up for my story.
She says, write what you don't know about what you know. That's your juice. That's what you're writing about. And I think that she would go in there and then she would start making things up just to watch how things happened, because that would be part of what you don't know about a situation.
There's these opposites moving, this energy, this kind of conflict. And when she taught writing, that was her theme. What's the conflict? How is there one story and then another story? How are they battling?
She would show early drafts of her work to her students. Drafts that weren't complete, that were awkward. If your teacher can show you where she is doing something incomplete, how much courage you have to then go and do something and rewrite, and rewrite and rewrite.
To hear her experiment, to hear her try things out, and to see her write one of those very elaborate sentences was very moving and very powerful. To think that a voice as inherently assured as hers had to hear it, listen to it, and listen it into being. That's it. That's the struggle.
I was a great non-finisher, okay? And I am that person to this day. And the day that I finished my first story was probably one of the, it had nothing to do with publishing, it had nothing to do with it was any good or anything. I actually finished the goddamn thing. So I was very happy. Of course, then I looked at it and I saw it wasn't quite finished.
The first time I really understood what a Jewish feminist pacifist was when I was arrested at the same time Grace was at the Women's Pentagon Action in 1980 in Washington, D.C. At that time, there was a very active anti-nuclear movement, anti-nuclear power and anti-nuclear weapons. We decided we needed a statement of purpose, a statement what became known as the Unity Statement, that would describe that we saw all of these issues of oppression as being connected.
We are gathering at the Pentagon November 17th because we fear for our lives. We fear for the life of this planet, our Earth, and the life of the children who are our human future. We have come to mourn and rage and defy the Pentagon because it is the workplace of the imperial power which threatens us all. Every day, while we work, study...
We didn't know how the hell we were going to do it, but we did it. We did it surrounding the Pentagon and no speeches.
And even that we tried to do in a little bit different way. Because Grace and the others had come up with the idea of weaving a web of life as opposed to destruction, literally weaving with yarn the doors of the Pentagon shut.
Like a mountain. Oh.
And part of the art itself was the police constantly cutting the yarn and the women reconnecting. The police would cut it, the women would reconnect it.
Like a mountain. Oh.
And that we did it all together, and that it was so emotional that it was really based on feeling. It was just so powerful.
We oppose the financial connections between the Pentagon and the multinational corporations and banks that the Pentagon serves. Those connections are made of gold and oil. We are made of blood and bone. We are made of the sweet resource, water.
I was arrested at the same time Grace was. Then I argued with the police over this issue, over that issue, and the whole time Grace was very quiet, very, very calm. She said to me, you know, this isn't where you should be putting your energy. She said, you know, don't worry about it. And I thought, where is her fire? And then an older woman fell as the police kind of very roughly pulled her up these stairs inside the Pentagon. And then Grace sprang into action. And very quickly, she was in charge. And even though she was standing there with handcuffs on, she was in charge of that setting. And I looked at her and I said, this is a Jewish pacifist.
PEN is an international association of writers that was started right after World War I in the hope that if writers got together across language barriers and cultural barriers, war would end.
You had to have a lot of credentials to be a member of PEN, or in theory you did.
Norman Mailer was president of PEN at the time, and he invited Secretary of State George Shultz.
The board of PEN just was livid.
Shultz and the Reagan administration supported apartheid in South Africa. The Sandinista government had been overthrown, and we were very upset that Mailer was using PEN as a forum for the Reagan administration.
A couple of people, including Grace, got together a petition which they planned to read out at the opening to say that this was not their wish that George Shultz be there.
Grace got up to present her petition, and Norman, as I recall it, pretended she didn't exist on the face of the earth. And she called after him, and she's going, Norman, Norman! I can't do that accent, but she's going, and
He's not good at concealing his feelings, Norman.
Yeah, he ignored her like she was a bag lady. This distinguished, great writer.
And then afterwards, of course, you know, there was an enormous furor, and all the press ran up to Norman and said, well, why wouldn't you recognize Grace Paley? And he told the Village Voice, and this is in print, I didn't bring the Secretary of State here to be pussy-whipped by Grace Paley.
He had a lot to do with planning this international conference, and he managed to have something like 120 men on the panels, and I think 16 or less women among all of those. So those of us who had been feminist writers for some years were very upset to see that there were only these few women on the panel among all these luminaries.
And none of us had been to a meeting like that in 2 decades.
You know, it was really a weird feeling, like you'd been dragged back into the 50s.
And nobody quite could put their finger on it at first until Grace and that moment. I mean, what was wrong with this? Gray suits! Nothing but gray suits!
During the session where people could ask questions in the big hall, she said, some of us women have been upset that there aren't enough women speakers, and so we're having a meeting here in this hall tomorrow at noon to discuss it.
Grace reminded us of our activist muscles that we'd forgotten about. Everybody knew what to do.
And we decided we wanted to form a committee to ensure that women's voices would never again be left out like that in any PEN event. At the next day's press conference after this women's meeting, the press all asked Norman, why were there so few women speakers? And he said, look, this wasn't just a writers' conference. We wanted this to be not just any writers, but writers who are also intellectuals.
Norman, sort of under his breath from the dais, said, real writers ought to have balls.
He was incredibly threatened by this panoply of wonderful women that didn't fit into his stereotype.
Well, right, Grace wasn't elegant. She didn't wear heels. No. She wore, as Norman said, she looks like she's wearing a house dress. She wasn't interested in that.
Grace enveloped the best things in a traditional woman's life, but was also an artist and also an activist and a very strong feminist. It sort of combined all these things when simple-minded people thought you couldn't.
And she made us feel that we weren't really neglecting our writing by caring about these other issues, that they were just as important as our writing.
Part of what I love about the story Traveling is it bridges together all of her worlds. And for me, even more importantly than that, is it bridges together the past, like the history of my family, and the present of my family, and the future of my family.
My mother and sister were traveling south. The year was 1927. They had begun their journey in New York. Their bus was an express and stopped only in Philadelphia, Wilmington, and now Washington. People who boarded in Washington knew where to seat themselves. My mother had heard that something like this would happen. My sister had heard of it too, but they had not lived in it. This reorganization of passengers by color happened in silence. My mother and sister remained in their seats, which were about 3/4 of the way back. When everyone was settled, the bus driver began to collect tickets. My sister saw him coming. She pinched my mother. "Ma, look." Of course my mother saw him too. What frightened my sister was the quietness. The white people in front, the black people in back, all silent. The driver sighed and said, "You can't sit here, ma'am. It's for them," waving over his shoulder at the Negroes among whom they were now sitting. "Move, please." My mother said, "No." He said, "You don't understand, ma'am. It's against the law. You have to move to the front." My mother said, "No." When I first tried to write this scene, I imagined my mother saying, "That's all right, mister. We're comfortable. I can't change my seat every minute." I read this invention to my sister, and she said it was nothing like that. My mother did not try to be friendly or pretend innocence. While my sister trembled in the silence, my mother said, for the third time, quietly, "No." About 15 years later, in 1943, in early summer, I rode that bus for about 3 days from New York to Miami Beach, where my husband, in sweaty fatigues, along with hundreds of other boys, was trudging up and down the streets and beaches to prepare themselves for war. My excitement about travel in the wide world was damaged a little by a sudden fear that I might not recognize Jess or he me, and we hadn't seen each other for 2 months. I took a photograph out of my pocket. I'd know him. I had been sleeping, waking, reading, writing, dozing, waking so many hours. The movements of the passengers was something like a tide that sometimes ebbed and now seemed to be noisily rising. I opened my eyes to the sounds of new people brushing past my aisle seat and looked up to see a colored woman holding a large sleeping baby who, with the heaviness of sleep, his arms so tight around her neck, seemed to be pulling her head down. I looked and noticed that I was in the last white row. The press of travelers had made it impossible for her to move farther back. She was so tired, and I'd been sitting and sitting for a day and a half at least, not thinking, refusing to think. I offered her my seat. She looked to the right and left as well as she could. Softly she said, "Oh, no, no." I became fully awake. A white man was standing right beside her, but on the other side of the invisible, absolute racial border. Of course she couldn't accept my seat. Her sleeping child hung mercilessly from her neck. She shifted a little to balance the burden, and she whispered to herself, "I just don't know." So I said, "At least give me the baby." First she turned, barely looking at the man beside her. He made no move, so, to my surprise, obviously out of sheer exhaustion, she disengaged the child from her body and placed him on my lap. I closed my eyes for a couple of minutes, but suddenly opened them to look up into the face of a white man talking. In a loud voice, he addressed me. Lady, I wouldn't have touched that thing with a meat hook. I thought, oh, this world will end in ice. I could do nothing but look straight into his eyes. I did not look away from him. Then I held that boy a little tighter, kissed his curly head, pressed him closer so he began to squirm, so sleepy. He reshaped himself inside my arms. His mother tried to narrow herself away from that dangerous border, too frightened at first to move at all. After a couple of minutes, she leaned forward a little, placed her hand on the baby's head, and held it there until the next stop. I couldn't look up into her mother face. Now, I write this remembrance more than 50 years later. I look back at that mother and child, how young she is. Her hand on his head is quite small, though she tries by spreading her fingers wide to hide him from the white man. But the child I'm holding, his little face as he turns toward me, is the brown face of my own grandson, my daughter's boy. The open mouth of the sleeper, the full lips, the thick little body of a child who runs wildly from one end of the yard to the other, leaps from dangerous heights with certain experienced caution, muscling his body, his mind for coming realities. On such a journey, when I was still quite young, I first knew my grandson, first held him close, but could protect him for only about 20 minutes 50 years ago. My daughter adopted him and his sister. We got him when he was about 2 months old. And Sienna came into our life when she was 5 days old. It's been a very interesting love affair in our life with these two children. It is destiny.
I am afraid of nature. Because of nature, I am mortal. My children and my grandchildren are also mortal. I lived in the city for 40 years. In this way, I escaped fear. When this old body finds that old body, what a nice day it is. When that old body loves this old body, it's dreamless to sleep and busy to wake up. When this old body says, you're a little lumpy here and there, but you're the same old body after all. Old body in which somewhere between crooked toe and forgetful head, the flesh encounters soul and whispers, you.
She was a kitchen writer. She never had a desk. She always tried to make a place to write and was usually not successful. My mother was always interrupted. She was interrupted and she interrupted. She didn't get a lot of things done that she wanted to get done. However, my opinion is that it was part of her work. Even when she would say she wasn't working, she was working. So this idea of interruption is just, it's energy, really. It's more energy and more information coming into the subject matter.
I'm glad to be reading this poem. It's my father at 89. His brain simplified itself, saddening everyone. But he asked us, children, don't you remember my dog Mars, who met me on the road when I came home, lonesome and singing, walking from the Tsar's prison? My father, he said something wonderful. When the book came out, he read the first story and he said, I thought this was like a flash in the pan. He said, then I read another couple stories, he said, and you're okay, kid.
I feel known by her and loved by her. And she has this capacity, and she also has this kind of relationship with others. And it's such a truly an enrichment of my life.
I think that's one of the teachings of Grace's life. Enjoy being yourself with yourself, offering yourself rather than, persona. And, let the chips fall where they may. But this ride that we have called life, if it's to mean anything, it has to mean that you make it through it as yourself. And she did that. And in my opinion, the universe really expects us to have a great time here. And I hope she did, and I think she did.
These are our times, and they're global times, and we live through them together, and we're lucky we have literature and art and children. It is the responsibility of the poet to listen to gossip and pass it on in the way storytellers decant the story of life. There is no freedom without fear and bravery. There is no freedom unless earth and air and water continue, and children also continue. It is the responsibility of the poet to be a woman, to keep an eye on this world and cry out like Cassandra, but be listened to this time.